All right, ladies and gentlemen, fellow coders, welcome to this next lesson in our ongoing series where I hope to create a Spring Boot web app with a React.js front end, and we're building it from scratch. So in this one, we're going to be learning a little bit about Spring security, specifically by using Json Web Tokens. This is a stateless technology, meaning there is no state stored for a specific authentication request coming from the front end, which is what you need when you have an app that has a separate front end, detached from the back end. Headless is another way to say that. JWT security is all the rage these days, and it's because we have these emerging applications that are using single page applications, React, that kind of thing. So yeah, this is what we need to do, and I'm going to be diving into it in this video. So the first thing we need to do in our app is to essentially include some configuration steps, in order to create and configure our security layer that we are putting into our app. Now, by default, we already have a security layer built in. As soon as we add it in our POM file, I haven't shown this yet, but excuse my voice, I still have a cold. In our POM file, this has been created when we went to start.spring.io. I believe in the last video we did that. And we chose our dependencies, and I went through a list of dependencies. When we did that, it added all these dependencies, one of which was Spring Boot Starter Security. Security is Spring Security, and it's right here that it's telling us it generated a password for us. So by default, out of the box, as soon as you include this dependency in your POM file, project object model file, this is a Maven technology. Once you include that, it will add security for your entire application, which means that if you go to your application, so if you go to our application, localhost 8080, it immediately asks us to sign in. So this page, even though we didn't create this page, it is created and served to us from Spring Security, the built-in package. And again, the default username and password was something like admin. I can't remember what or no, not the password. It's not, the password was given to us here. And I don't think it was admin. I think it was user was the name, the default name of the user. User, and paste that for that copied from the console. And then it lets us in, and then we get a different error because we don't have anything on our root localhost 8080 yet. There's no endpoint there, so it just says 404 not found. Okay, so what do we do to add in our layer of security using JWT, Json Web Tokens? There's this wonderful article from TopTal. TopTal is a company that focuses on hiring top talent. They'd really be a great sponsor. But anyway, so they have a great article on how to do this with Spring Security and whatnot. It's a great article. I would highly recommend it. It's very high level, or very high end code, if you will. So instead of you having to go through and read everything there, I'm going to sort of walk you through it in this video. So the first thing that we need to do, and I should say this video is going to go pretty long if I try to do everything that is in that article, so this might be broken up into a few videos. But the first thing we need to do is add in the security sort of configuration details. Let me just now scroll back down to where I was before in the article. So you usually have some sort of a security config file that you add. It doesn't need to be called security config, but it's a good name. And any config file that you create, I typically put into a config package. So I'm going to right click on my base package here, which is the COM Coders Campus and then assignment submission app, right click, new class. And then with a new class, you can define the package. So I'm going to go to the package here and say dot config. So it's going to create a new package called config. And the name of this class is going to be security config, okay, or configuration. Either one works. So security config will be the name of our class. Again, it doesn't have to be called this. This is just a really good name for the class. And then what we do to tell it that this is our Spring security configuration is we use the enable, I think it's web security. So enable web security annotation comes from Spring Framework .security. So it comes from Spring Security. Voila. Excuse me. Now we also want to make this work such that we extend something called the Web Security Configurer Adapter. A little bit complex. Web Security Configurer Adapter, control space. Web Security Configurer Adapter also comes from Spring Framework Security. There we go. Adapter, so Web Security Configurer Adapter from Spring Security, and that just lets it know that, hey, this is we're using Spring Security here in our application. If you want to go into the adapter, you can hit F3 on it and go and see all the stuff that we are using as a part of this class that we are extending. There's a bunch of stuff, but there's two methods in there. There's two methods in here that we want to essentially override. Two methods that are configure methods. So if I type in configure, and hit, I think that's what it is, control space, there are two, I think these are protected methods, if I'm correct. Is that what the yellow diamond is protected? So I'm able to override the default behavior of these configure methods. So by default, as we saw, there is already some default behavior that we are using. I believe that comes probably with the Web Security Configure Adapter that we saw when I booted up, right? It set a default password that it generated for us, and it showed us that login page. Like, that came from somewhere, that there's code for that somewhere to work, right? That likely comes, part of it anyway, comes from this Web Security Configure Adapter. However, that default functionality that we saw is not desirable. So we want to override that functionality to do something more custom to what we want, i.e. we want a stateless security mechanism, which is the JWT, Json Web Token, that I talked about, which is what we need if we're using a distributed application with a single page application, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, all the rage. So you type in configure control space, and there are two different methods you want to override. I'm going to double click on the first one. I'm going to type in configure again, control space, and double click on the second one. So one overrides the Authentication Manager Builder property being sent in. I shouldn't say property, parameter. And the other one overrides with the HTTP security parameter being sent in. So right now our code just says, hey, don't do anything special, just call the existing code. That's what the automatically generated stubs do. That's, in other words, we're saying don't change any behavior at all. So we want to change this because we want to be able to change the behavior. So one thing that we want to do here is you want to have it hook up with our database. So we have a database that we've created with users stored inside of it. We want to be able to query that database to see if a username and password that we're given matches up with what's stored in the database. So how do we do this? We leverage in here. I'm sort of looking at the code and then trying to, convert the code from what I'm reading into text here on the screen. So you want to leverage this parameter that is being passed in, which is the auth parameter. So we want to do auth dot, and we want to leverage the user details service. So user details service is a method here where we are supplying a user details service to this particular authentication manager builder. So inside of this user details service method, we want to pass in a user detail service. So what is that? What is a user detail service? Well, it is essentially a service that is used to load users from our database, okay? And I'll show you how we can implement this ourselves. So user detail service here, the class that it wants, it comes from Spring Security, right? So if I click on it, user detail service, it's an interface that comes from Spring Security. So what we can do is we can implement that interface. That's what Java is all about with inheritance. So let's implement that interface and create a service ourselves. So same process here, just like we created the config class, let's create a service class. New class. We'll call this user details service impl, because it's an implementation of something. Let's put it in the .service package because it is a service. And if you want to, you can add an interface here, but I like to say finish, and then I put it in here myself. So I say implements user details service. okay, which comes from Spring Framework security. Okay, as soon as we implement that, it says, hold on, there's a problem. You have not implemented one of the required methods. So if you look at user detail service, control click, left click on it, it has this one method, which is a load by username method. So this is a public abstract method, which means we have to override this method if we want to fulfill the user detail service interface contract. What does that mean? You hover over it and you click add unimplemented methods. So what that does is it will override that load by username method that is inside of the user detail service. So what does load by username do? How do we make this work, right? Well, this should interface with, talk to our repository to see if a user exists or not inside of that repository. Okay? So for now, what we can have it do, just for fun, is always return a new user with some stuff inside of it, right? We can just say return a new user, and that'll be the end of it for now. In other words, everyone is authenticated. As soon as you try to load by username, whatever username you pass in, it'll just return the same user over and over. We're hard coding some stuff in here for the purposes of keeping things simple. So what user? Well, you can import it. It's the user that we've already defined from the domain package in our, application. Okay, so I'm going to import that user right here. We imported that line here. Now, it's saying, hold on, this user doesn't match the type that I expected it to be. It's expecting, by it, I mean this load by username method. This load by username method is expecting a user details type of object. And what we're telling it to return is not a user details type of object. So what the heck? What is user details? It comes from Spring Security, and it is an interface. So what we can do here is, and this is a bit of a shortcut way of doing things, if I were being a bit more fancy with my code, I would make a different user object and have it implement this user details interface to sort of separate my user from the Spring Security implementation details. But I mean, it's not too big a deal. Really, you would do that separation of the two if you plan on replacing Spring Security in the future. I've never done that, so I'm going to put it right into our user. So this user class, I went into it, is the user class we created, I don't know, a video or two ago. And it's just our user. It has an ID, a cohort start date, username, password. What we can do is we can say, hey, this user class implements the contract of user details. Implements user details. And that gets imported from Spring Security. So, hold on. What is user details again? Let's go in here and look. User details comes from Spring Security. Spring Security right here. And it has a few abstract methods. Get password, get username, is account non-expired, is account non-locked, is credentials not-expired, and is enabled. So there's essentially 6 properties that we are forced to use, 6 properties or fields that we're forced to use here when we implement this interface. So guess what? We already have a get username and a get password, right? User details here wants me to have a get password and a get username. We already have them. They're right here. Username is right here. Get username and get password, right? Cool. So technically we can just say at override, right? Cool. So we override the parent or the interfaces method, and same with this one. Get password just returns the password. Cool. We've now fulfilled 2 of the 6 properties that we need to use or override. So if we hover over the user and say, hey, we add the unimplemented methods of the other ones. What are the other methods that are unimplemented? Let's find out. They are this one. Oh, I forgot the get authorities. Right. It needs to override get authorities, is account non-expired, is account non-locked, blah, blah, blah. Basically, for these ones, the is, these are options for fine-tune, grain, whatever the word is, your user accounts. So if you want to have the ability to expire an account, you can do that. If you want to have an ability to lock an account for some reason, you can do that. Like you might want to lock an account if someone hasn't paid their bill. You lock their account. You can expire the account if for some reason, they paid for 12 months, and then at the 12-month mark, you can expire it then. You can have it so they have to refresh their credentials, so their credentials can expire in a revolving window, and then you can just have a straight up enabled yes or no, right? So there's another, that's like a master switch on off. But really, if you want to just have a solution that just works day one, you return true for all these things. So all of them are not expired, all of them are not locked, all of them are not expired with their credentials, and all of them are enabled. In other words, check, 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 we're good to go. Don't try to stop these people from logging in. Now, I forgot about this complexity. So they must use a granted authority. So again, this all comes from Spring. Spring has something called authorities, which I wanted to avoid using authorities, but hey, my hand is being forced here by using authorities. What an authority is a role. So if you remember a little while back, we talked about users having roles. Student role, code reviewer role, and admin role. That's really just a granted authority. If you look at granted authority, this comes from Spring Security. It's another interface that comes from Spring Security. And all it does is it requires you to return an authority. What is an authority? It's a role. That's all it is. It's a role. So this is just saying, hey, it needs to return a role. Okay, this user needs to return a role. So what we can do is we can create, let's see, get authorities needs a collection of granted authorities. Can we just create, what's a default simple way to always make them be like a student or something? Let's see, need a collection, so we can have a list of granted authority objects, right? But granted authority is an interface. So we would need to have something that implements that interface. Can I just say new granted authority? No. Right? Because then I need to override the get authority, which could just say return role, student. Right? And then that returns a list of granted authorities, roles, and then we can just say return roles. Again, I'm sort of hacking the system here to get going quickly. So is there a better way to do this? Can I do no, I can't give it I was trying to use a Lambda function to create granted authority roles. What we really should do is we should have in our domain, we should have roles that are associated to the user, right? So we should create a new domain object called, we can call it authority or just role, but authority is kind of more in line with the wording that they use. And then you can create an entity with this, right? So this can be the authority table, and this authority table, each one can have an ID, and each one could belong back to a user. Okay. What this implies is it is a one-to-many between, well, not yet anyway. It will be a one-to-many. One user can have many authorities, but any one authority is mapped back to one and only one user. That's one way to do it. You can have a join table as well, so that you can reduce the noise. But anyway, there's two different ways to do it. This is the less great way to do it, but again, I just want to sort of get up and running here. So anyway, you can make an argument to make this a many-to-many relationship between a user and an authority. Therefore, you can essentially have three, or you can have whatever many roles you want. So if you want to have three roles, a student, an admin, and a code reviewer in our application. So you can have an authority table with three roles, and that's it. That's all the data it has. It's just three roles. Okay, that's a very efficient way to do it. Then you have a join table that joins the two together, so a user could be associated to one or more of those three roles. I'm choosing to do it in the less performant way, which is we're going to be duplicating that role over and over and over again. So every new user will have a new role associated to it. So there's going to be duplicate data. It's not great. It's not a great design, but that table doesn't tend to get crazy. So I just take a shortcut because I'm lazy. ID, and this can be a generated value. Again, the identity or the strategy is identity, which is, I talked about this in the past video, which is leveraging MySQL's automatic increment strategy. Let's see. So ID user. Oh, and then you need the string role, or it's actually called authority, right? But we could really call it role if we want. It doesn't really matter. They both mean the same thing. The point is, this class authority implements granted authority, because that's what Spring Security wants from us, right? They want it to implement granted authority, which means oh, that's right. It needs to be called authority, because granted authority requires you to have a get authority, right? So we'll call it authority, and then you generate getters and setters. Alt-Shift-S, R. Generate getters and setters. Boom. It also probably wants you to implement serializable. I usually just hover over this warning and I have it add a generated serial version ID because I'm lazy. So there you go. It generates this version ID. Fine. We're not serializing this object, so we don't need to worry about it. At least I don't have to. I don't think we need to worry about it. So our authority has this information in it. So now we have a granted authority. Okay, I wanted to avoid that, but hey, when we go back to, where was it? User. So the user has this list of granted authorities. Now we don't have to do new granted authority. We can say new new authority. Authority was our object, right? Let me get rid of this noise. Right? We can have a new authority, but also we'd like to set what the role is for this authority, right? It needs to give you an actual role, aka authority. So what we can do is we can override this constructor. So the authority here has a no argument constructor, which is the one that we are using. But let's introduce a constructor, public authority. We'll do the no arg constructor, which just does nothing, because usually you need to add that in as well. And then we can add one in that passes in an authority, right? Where it does a this.authority equals authority. This is standard Java stuff. If you don't understand how to do constructors and injecting properties into constructors and leveraging, parameters into these constructors, yeah, this video is too advanced for you if you don't know that basic level stuff. So we implement the no arg because we typically need to do that for Spring to make it happy. And then we implement the one argument constructor, which we will then leverage in our little hack here. So we can pass in now a one argument constructor of a role. So we can say role student. Okay. And you need this role underscore prefix. This is what Spring Security demands of us. We must give it a prefix of role if you want it to work properly. Okay, so we generate a list of roles and then we return that list. This is not like a static ordered collection. It's not like it has a precise control over the list of inserted. It's not like a final. It's unmodifiable. They are unmodifiable. Elements cannot be added, removed, or replaced. I think this causes problems when you use an unmodifiable list. I don't want to do that. Unless there's a way to do it with an... yeah. I've done this so long, I've run into problems with that, and it's a really confusing problem because it can't modify the roles now because it's an unmodifiable list of roles. So let me do it another way. Let me say new equals new array list, because this is modifiable. You can modify an array list, right? And then we can say roles.add new granted authority. There. Control-Shift-O to import array list, and there you go. So now instead of using list.of, we now have a modifiable list, and that usually plays better with Spring or Hibernate. Anyway, somewhere it caused a problem if it is using an unmodifiable list. Cool. You can see how confusing this gets with Spring Security. Thankfully, this is only sort of a set it up once and you're good to go type thing. But I did warn you that this would take more than one video. So let's go back. What launched all of this madness? How come Trevor was going into all these details all over the place? Well, it's because first we were doing this. We were trying to pass in a user details service to our configure method way back when we were doing remember we created the security config class, which extended that adapter, which had these two protected methods that we are now overriding the functionality of these configure methods. By default, the behavior was it shows you a login page. Wherever you go in the app, it shows you a login page with the username and password. Cool, but that's not what we want. We don't want to show that for everything. So we want to override that functionality. The first thing that we're overriding is passing in a user details service. So in order to pass something in here to this user details service, we need to have a user details service, right? Where does that come from? Well, over here, we have a user details service impl, which by the way, I forgot to annotate with @service. So now when we annotate with @service, Control-Shift-O to import, this comes from, it'll now be managed by Spring. Spring on boot will instantiate this user details service for me. And what happens is whenever anyone tries to log in with any username, it's just going to return a brand new user, which is not that helpful. Let me assign this user to a variable and say user.set username to the one that they're passing in at least. And then user.set password, we can set it to some ABC. Let's do ASDF because I love that. So we're hard coding a user to return here, right? And then we'll say user.setID or something to be 1 or something. Okay, so and it has to be a long, so that's why the L is there. It's a long data type. Cool. So, bada bing, bada boom. We are returning a user. The only curveball is I think we need to use, this needs to be encrypted if I'm not mistaken, but we'll see if it boots up. So I think, and I just save, I need to grab this. So this user detail service, because it's annotated here with @service, this class is going to be managed by Spring, which means we can inject it. We can auto-wire it in. So for our security config, in order to auto-wire it in, I don't think you can just auto-wire. I don't think we can do that. Let's see. Service, and then copy, paste it in here. Control-Shift-O to import the auto-wired. Let me just open up my article and double check the article here. Yeah, I think we need to inject it into the constructor for the class. I don't think this will work. I'll double check, but we'll see. So let's just put a breakpoint in here and see if it even gets into the breakpoint. Okay, so we'll fire this up. There's probably going to be some errors, so let's brace ourselves. But that's the beauty of these things. Oh my God, it actually got into, so look what happened. It created the table authority, right? So it did that because, remember, we created a new entity. We created the authority entity right here. So it created an authority table with these 3 values: ID, authority, and then there is a, create a tiny blob. That's not right. Oh, I forgot to add, sorry. That's not right. I forgot to add the relationship. So the user is a many to one. Whoops. This is why we do this. And it's always good to double check your table creation, SQL that it does. So, whoops, let me stop. Let me save it. And let me delete this table. So I'm going to go to my SQL and refresh this database. You see there's an authority table in here now with this user that's a tiny blob. No, that should not be a tiny blob. That should be a foreign key reference. So I'm going to say drop table authority because I want it to drop the table. And then I'm going to reboot the application again so that it recreates a table now, hopefully with the proper foreign key. So now I still did tiny blob. So hold on. Why am I'm missing something obvious. Many to one back to user. Cascade I don't want to worry about. optional false, because you can't have an authority without a user. Yeah, that's true. Anything else? Fetch, cascade. Many to one. What am I missing? Entity, authority, user is my user, right? Yes. I don't think we need to have a reference here back to. Oh, right. I should probably have a generated serial version ID, whatever. Anyway, I don't think that's going to make a difference. I don't think we need a reference. Do we need a reference here? I mean, we probably should, because it's just going to be more. It's going to be a pain to not have it there. Let's add it in. So basically, a user can have a list of authority objects. We'll call it authorities equals new array list. Okay. Control-Shift-O to import, and then we'll do a getter setter here. So we'll do it, I don't know, maybe here. We'll say get a getter setter for authorities, and oh, right. So, sorry, hold on. I put I'm so used to putting okay, so here's what I did. I mixed up my usage of annotations. So I used an annotation at the field level here, and then I mixed and matched and put the annotation at the method level, which is a no-no. You got to choose one, not both. That's what I'm missing. The many-to-one should be right here. Okay, so that probably will solve our problem. That's probably the bug in my code. But we probably should also add the authorities. But let me comment this code out for the set. Oh, and this was the get authorities. Right. Let me just delete that for now. And then reboot my code just to make sure I caught that error. So let me redrop the table because I don't want to. Let me drop table authority. So now I've dropped it again. I will run it in debug mode with my updated code with the annotation in the correct place. You got to stay consistent. You can't mix and match. Okay. Create table authority. User ID big int, not null. There we go. That is the constraint. Foreign key constraint back to the user. Voila. So I caught my bug. That's my bad. Okay. Cool. I knew there was something I'm missing. But now, to the feature of our presentation, is user detail service null or not null? My guess is it is null, but let's see. Let's hover over. It's not null. Yay. At least I think it's not null. It looks like it's not null, right? That would say null if it was null, but I can't see the details of the user details. That's odd. But if I say go, so let it play through, are there any errors? It started up. Oh my goodness. So if I go to my localhost 8080, refresh, it says please sign in. Now if I sign in with any username, testing, and then pass in, I guess it doesn't matter the password. I can pass in nothing and say sign in. It's, yeah, I think it let me log in, right? At least it didn't show an error. Let's see if I was rejected. Oh, there's an error. Hold on. There is no password encoder. Okay, so like I said, I think we need a password encoder. Okay, so this is the final thing I'll attack in this video. So in our security config Java file, along with the user detail service, we need to have a password encoder. So typically what we do is we leverage something called the bcrypt password encoder. Okay, so bcrypt password encoder is a great password encoder that you can just leverage that's built in. I don't even know where it comes from. Where does it come from? Anyway, what you can do is define, it comes from Spring Security. So it's built into Spring Security. So what you can do is you can create a bean in here. Okay, so you can create this as a separate class if you like. You could create it as a separate class, mark it as a component so that Spring manages it, or you can just create it as a bean in here because you really only need to leverage it in here. It's just a lazy way to do it. So you can create a bean. The bean returns a password encoder because it wants a password encoder as the type. So password encoder is the type of the bean that is being returned from this little method or this little constructor method that we're creating here. So public password encoder is our bean. and we have it return a new bcrypt password encoder. Okay, and then let me implement bean, and this, my syntax is wrong. Public return type. Do I need to say password encoder? Yeah, and then I need to import password encoder from Spring Security. I thought I did that already, but anyway. Okay, boom. So now we have the password encoder bean created. Now I think we need to inject that into our, let me terminate the application. I think we need to inject it into, I'm just checking I'm referencing the code over here. I think we need to inject it somewhere. I think. Interesting. User detail service dot password encoder. Okay. And then what is password encoder? It is this bean. So we need to reference this bean, which is really just calling that method. Okay. So that should work, except now that we have a password encoder, my code to grab the load user by username, which was in here, I'm hard coding the password in the user detail service implementation where we load the user by username. We're hard coding the raw password, which it thinks that this is the encoded password. This is not the encoded password. So we need to grab that encoder. Normally we wouldn't really do this. I'm going to auto wire in that password encoder bean that we created earlier in the whatchamacallit method, or in the other class. So now we can get access to this password encoder, this bcrypt password encoder, and we can say password encoder dot encode a raw password. So we can now say encode ASDF. So what that's going to do is it's going to encode ASDF as a string and store it properly so that it's encoded, so that it can decode it properly. And then when you type in ASDF as the password, it will accept that password as a password. Otherwise, it wouldn't accept it because the matched password or whatever wouldn't work. Oops, form recycle. What did I do? Security config, user, what am I doing? User detail service, impl, uses password encoder. Am I not all, is this not a reasonable place to park your car? What am I doing wrong here? So it doesn't like, there's a circular dependency. So apparently you can't auto wire that in. Again, am I missing something? I thought you could just do that. I thought you could auto wire that in. Relying upon circular items is discouraged and they are prohibited by default. So, do we need to have a separate password encoder class? Password encoder, new bcrypt password encoder. And that stores it as a bean, which should then be available. Let me try something different. Let me go to, what would this password encoder be considered? Kind of like a utility? Yeah, so I could create a new class called, well, I don't want to create a new class though. Hold on. I mean, I guess I can create a custom password encoder, even though it's not a custom password encoder. We'll put this in a util package. I don't usually have to do this, so I think I've done something strange. But let me mark this as a component, and I will have the custom password encoder do what? It will be a component that will return a bcrypt password encoder, right? And then we will use the custom password encoder as being the managed, as being the password encoder that we use everywhere. So when it gets created, so the custom password encoder will, well, again, the bean should return the password encoder, right? So this has a property, a private password encoder, right? And this, I'm going to do Control-Shift-O to import the component and the password encoder. So what is password encoder? This .password encoder equals new bcrypt password encoder, essentially. And then we can have it have a getter. We don't need a setter method, just a getter. So that's, I mean, that's kind of what I was doing inside of, again, I'm probably missing something when I did it in the bean. Did I, let me double check their code in case I, typoed or something. Bean, public, password encoder, return new bcrypt. No, that's exactly what I did. I don't know. Okay, so then instead of doing this, we don't need to define a bean in here. Now it's saying, uh-oh, I don't know what password encoder is. Well, we can auto-wire it from custom password encoder. Custom password encoder. Okay, so we can auto-wire that object in, and then we could say custom password encoder dot get the password encoder, right? Which is just a bcrypt password encoder that we are managing. So I don't see how this is going to fix the problem, the circular dependency. And if it doesn't, that's okay. We will debug. So field required. Sorry, what? Consider defining a bean of type password encoder in your configuration. Usually required a bean of type password encoder that could not be found. What did I do wrong? Yeah, it needs a password encoder. Well, that's what get password encoder does. It returns a password encoder, which when we get it, it returns, it has a, yeah. So that looks fine to me. Injection point. Consider defining a bean of type blah. Field password encoder in user detail service. Field what in user detail service? This is not user detail service. This is. So this is saying, hey, I require, oh, because I'm auto wiring, sorry. I need to auto wire custom password encoder, right? Which is our custom password encoder. So password encoder dot get password encoder dot encode, right? So that should help that. But again, is this going to go back to the circular dependency problem? I've never had to do this before. This is odd. Let's see if I'm just recreating the problem. I did not recreate the problem. So I fixed the problem. So for some obvious reason that is not obvious to me, my previous code was not good. Maybe I defined the bean in the wrong spot or didn't pass it properly in. I don't know. Okay, so we have a user detail service. Beautiful. And then we have the password encoder. Beautiful. So if we say go, it should boot up. And then now when we visit our page, right? So we go to try to access the root. It's going to redirect us to log in. We can type in, hopefully, whatever username we want. And really, whatever password we want, I can type in like 5. It's going to return a proper user with a right password, sign in, bad credentials. Not what I expected. So I was expecting it to let us through. So I guess the credentials didn't match the password that was in the database. So I guess if I do say Trevor, I need to type in ASDF to match the credentials that I have in there. There you go. Okay, so that's what I need to do. So you do have to match the credentials because in the user detail service where I hard coded the password, this is the password that it's checking against, it's validating against when we typed it in the front end in the password screen where we had the username password. I typed in 5. I should have typed in ASDF. So cool. You see what we've done here? It's taken a while, but we've overridden the one part of the process of the authentication mechanism that Spring Security uses. So we now have our own method in here, load by username, that we can leverage to verify the details of the user's data that we type in the front end. So if I reboot again to show you, we now have a mechanism to verify the credentials over here. When I go to localhost 8080, the credentials we type in here have to match the password that we put into our load by, where is it? Our password in here, right? So in other words, since we hard coded this, but we could actually query this from the database. So instead of doing this code and hard coding it, we could actually load a user from the database via that username and see if the passwords match, right? That's not what we're doing. We'll do that in the next video. I was just trying to be quick about it so we can get to the point. So now when I sign in with the wrong password, it's not gonna let me in. Cool? So let's, as far as we'll get here, we have not talked about JWT yet, and we have not hooked it up to our database. So those are pending tasks that we will tackle, hopefully in the next video, but I can't promise. Obviously, I'm long-winded. I like to explain everything as I go. Although I'm fast in explaining, that's the beauty of YouTube. You can go back and listen to this again and again. And I completely forgot to say, hey, by the way, if you love the way I teach, if you really enjoy these kinds of videos, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. And if you want to get yourself into a boot camp and get a job as a coder, I run boot camps, so you can check it out. Coders Campus. Let me just go to it now. coderscampus.com/bootcamp. And you can go, we have boot camps for pretty much everyone. You can click on the Apply Now button. And if you're lucky, you can even click here and talk to me. You can start a live call with me. Isn't that fun? So if you're interested in getting a job as a coder and you have 20 hours a week on your hands and are dedicated to learning this stuff over the course of the next 6 to 9 months, we have a boot camp that gets you that exact outcome. So cool. Thanks for watching till the end. I will see you in the next lesson. Take care of yourself. Happy learning, and bye for now.